As you all are aware of, we now have traveled around the world once in the spirit, in prayer. We've covered Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia Pacific, and the Americas this morning. And well, of course, we have not covered them in any full sense of the word, but we prayed into it. And my understanding and my perception is we prayed in the Lord and with the Lord into a number of very crucial topics and situations, and so I'm very grateful and very pleased. Now, as for this next session, I just want to mention it for us to prepare our hearts in this next sessions, especially with the help of Chuck being here amongst us. We want to get a global perspective. We focus on the different continents, and now we talk about nations from a global perspective. Nations and Israel, Israel and the nations.
I'm going to introduce a special friend of ours, Corinne Lafitte, who is a wonderful psalmist in the nation of France. God has used Corinne and her husband for 30 years to be a voice on behalf of God's heart for Israel there. She's a beautiful songwriter, she's a beautiful songwriter, writes beautiful songs, and like my wife. And she's written a song on Jerusalem that she's going to share.
Yeah, so thank you, Rick. The first, the 5 or 6 first, it's the sentences are the Psalm 2. So you know it by heart, I'm sure. Why the nation rage against the Lord, and the Lord is laughing, and saying what they are doing is whatever they do, I will be glorified anyway. And after that, it is the Lord who is singing. So it is, I've chosen Jerusalem for my name to be a home for my name. And I'm making of Jerusalem a heavy stone, for the nation. I will spread on Jerusalem, I will anoint her with a spirit of grace and supplication. Yes, she will call unto my name, and I will answer her. You didn't recognize when I visited you, and when I sent to you the prophets. And you will not see me again until you will say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. And then there is the chorus, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. I so many times I wanted to put you under my arms. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I cried so many times on you. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I hear the cries of Rachel crying. And the day will come where you will be able to say, the Messiah is here. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the beloved city, the city who is like a bride, And the day will come where you will be able to say, the Messiah is here, and your glory will be there. Yes, so it's in French. Yes. And my children are playing the violin and everything around. I have to say
Pourquoi les nations s'agitent-elles contre l'Éternel, contre son oint? Pourquoi les nations se liguent-elles contre l'Éternel, contre ses desseins? Il rit celui qui siège dans les cieux, il voit leur manigance, il se moque d'eux. Les projets des nations sont à ses yeux comme une goutte d'eau au fond d'un seau. J'ai choisi Jérusalem pour y faire demeurer
Jerusalem and the nations. The nations and Jerusalem. Psalm 2 and this beautiful song. Well, it's one thing that the song is moving me so much. But at the same time as you were singing the song, I was so much thinking about Gregory and his assignment, which is so special, so dear to me. And I want to take the moment to pray for him. But before we do, you have to explain a little bit what he's doing and what's happening on June 5.
So, Gregory, some of you are knowing Gregory. They come to me and they say, "You're the mother of Gregory." So I'm very honored. Really, I told him and he was touched. So Gregory was called by the Lord, in fact, to join Thomas Sandel in ECI. ECI in English. And Thomas gave him, in fact, the task to be at the UN New York. Gregory had New York on his heart for a long time. He was living in the United States some years ago, and he had New York every time. The Lord was reminding him that he had to pray for New York. And finally, now he's in the UN in New York. He's going around every month or 2 months, and they are organizing a dinner or breakfast for the representative of the nations in New York. What he has on his heart is to lift up the nation and before the Lord and say, "Lord, convince them that they have to be at the right place, goat or sheep," as the call is on our dear brother Harald. And so they are asking each nation, please consider that before the Lord, And many presidents, in fact, even, are saying to Gregory, yes, we have to consider that, So pray for them, pray for Thomas, pray for the team there, and really, it is something exceptional that the Lord is doing.
When I'm in Africa, it's like being in East Texas and Louisiana. I grew up in the same spirit. It's got this mix of religion and superstition all rolled together, and it just creates fear in God's people from being powerful and prophetic. And you have to break through it. If you don't break through it, what it does is it will always counteract the prophetic voice of God. And that's what goes on. And Islam is very powerful, but I don't think people see the occult structure behind it that is speaking it. But it's not just Islam that has that. It's got as much mixed through Christianity that has to be broken out to keep, that's keeping the African nations from coming fully aligned into God's covenant plan. So we agree right now that will happen. When you start thinking about a global move of God, a lot of people can't grab hold of God's global plan, that the nations are his inheritance. That means his portion comes from the nations. He also says in Isaiah 56, verse 7, that he will have a joyful house of prayer for every people group. Every group of people will have the opportunity. I really think that is a better depiction of the Great Commission, that every people group will have a joyful house of prayer. One that is in connection with him. And I think that is our call to see that. And I also think there's an order that you have to see with the nations. It has to, when I go into a nation, I always evaluate how they are aligned with Israel. When I go into a state, when I go into a city, when I'm speaking, I always look and say, How is that nation moving toward God's covenant people? Then I always look and see what's the government of God doing in the nation. Is the church, is it moving in a kingdom authority, or is it moving in a church authority? And I believe we're in one of the greatest shifts right now worldwide for a new kingdom authority to come in place. Now let me show you a few things that will help us as we move forward. I showed this earlier. This looks like the season we're in. I can't think of a better picture that looks like this season. I had another one with a mountain behind it, because actually we're having to find our way into the future by using the word of the Lord. And the sword represents the word of the Lord. It represents favor, and this is a year that we're being favored. Now, it also means this, that the word of the Lord that has been spoken over nations is now coming into a fullness. Now, that's why I think this session is so important, because we have to understand that words that have been prophesied over nations this year start coming to a place of fullness. Because 7 is linked with finishing. It's linked with, and it doesn't matter what calendar you're using, you're in a time. We're in time, God's not in time. So he's making us respond to him out of time. And any prophetic person knows that they have to understand times and seasons. And 7 is always linked with finishing what has begun. I was looking at that when we were praying earlier, where we were praying actually over Job said that he would finish here in Jerusalem. He said that he started this movement in 2007, but he thought it was just going to be a short movement. But notice what we began to prophesy. Next year, something comes into a culmination of a new beginning, and we started prophesying the end from the beginning. And so right now, what this year is about is things that have been said over nations now all of a sudden start manifesting. And we've got to be able to see God manifesting in the nations, because it is part of the inheritance. Let's just look at what we heard sung so beautifully. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces, cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Now, another way of looking at it is this. Things that have been prophesied over nations are filling up a bowl, and some way this year, that bowl of prayer and prophecy pours out on us. And you've got to see that, because what happens when it pours out, it starts us moving in a whole new direction. So nations will start moving this year in a whole new direction. Go ahead, Chad. Now, this is an easier way to look at it. And because you're going to see a moment, a window coming over a nation. This begins this year, and you're going to see it accelerate over the next 3 years. A window will be coming over a nation. What happens this year is the sword of the Lord is coming down. That means the word of the Lord, the authority of the Lord is coming down, and the sword brings both separation and manifestation. So this is a year over nations that these windows are forming. See, that was why it was so good to see a window form over America, and all of a sudden we shifted this year. Which, those windows don't stay forever either. I was thinking about while we were praying for Africa, Nigeria, while they had Jonathan David in office, office, they were pro-Israel. The minute he's out of office, they're not pro-Israel any longer. And that's really not the way this should work. We should be able to stay aligned with this window over a nation until a full opportunity that God has given that nation comes. When we got here and I saw Suzette and Hattie, I first met her in Zimbabwe in 1986. It's been that long. Gosh, we've been around a while. In a prayer tent. And that was Zimbabwe's moment. Now look what happened after that. I remember the Lord visiting me there, and I started prophesying. I still have it written down of what would happen in Zimbabwe to shut that whole window that was there open over it. And so what we want to start watching now over these next 3 years is nation to nation to nation aligning from heaven to earth. And this is very, very key for us as we move forward. And it goes back to you reviewing prophetic words over nations. When God puts a nation on your heart, I always find the prophetic words, just like that word we had in 2008 in Germany, that a whole move would start out of Germany that would change all of Europe. And we're going to decree that that move is about to accelerate this year. Now, with that, look, here's several things that you want to look at. Heaven's atmosphere starts entering earth when this happens. One of the things that we have been known for is we try to keep a portal of the prophetic open at our place. It's not something... I can't say we have the best church and all of that, but we do have a peculiar window of the prophetic that is open where you walk in under it and all of a sudden you hear. And my goal has always been, and my submission to the Lord has always to be sure we keep that window open. So no matter who comes there, they're able to hear the Lord. And any nation, he says, prophesy to, we prophesy to. One of the things that we're going to start doing at this Rosh Hashanah is start taking nation by nation by nation and prophesying to it. So what we're talking about right now will begin to happen. And Norma and I were just talking about this. We started the Israel prayer focus 18 years ago. It now has over 180 nations that is connected into that focus. And that's sort of how I look. I'm going to prophesy into each one of those nations and ask the Lord to realign them back with Israel. But what happens also when that window opens is the angelic government gets activated. There is an angelic government. Lord Sabaoth is the God of the stars. He's the God of the host of heaven. And this government begins to be activated. And what it should be doing is aligning with us in a place in the earth realm. God's government, he's the God of the host. He's also the God of the armies of the earth. And what's happening right now, the two are starting to align. That's why we're having this new movement occur. Because we're seeing heaven and earth align, and the governments of heaven and the government of earth aligning. And I don't mean civil government. And if those two governments will stay aligned, we'll be able to prophesy into civil governments. And you have to understand you're up against a lot of structures. Let's take the United States, which has great influence on the nations of the earth. When we were in the meeting with Vice President Pence Every news agency was there. ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox. All of them were there. And when it was so pro-Israel, it wasn't communicated. See, all of a sudden you could see them back off from it. And that's what we also have to know, that one of the greatest wars, I don't have time to share it, but God gave me a dream several years ago, it'll be 8 years ago now, about one of the greatest war. He showed me the demonic ruling being over communications. Yeah. And he said, at the last 3 years of this decade, we must begin to war with this. This thing has 7 faces. And it had to be warred against. I really think it's one of the keys for the UN. The people who pray for the UN. They're going to have to understand this structure, because it's a communication ruling force. And I'll tell you how he showed it to me. It's very specific. It actually is initiated out of Rome. And then it takes its stand to communicate through the obelisk structure throughout the earth. And what it does is communicating to try to stop what God is saying about his covenant from being released and aligned. So we're going to have to look at the communication system in every nation also, and how it operates. I wrote an article one time on the media were meant to be the watchmen. When you see it in the Word of God in a structure in society like this, it was meant to be a watchman structure. That's what Satan has gotten in and so perverted, is that watchman structure. So we've got to see a penetration of that watchman structure. And then, of course, when we align, we are able to do the Lord's Prayer in the earth realm. We're to legislate heaven and earth. Go ahead. Now, with that, remember what I said. I went ahead and put this in there when we were prophesying earlier. There's going to be a 3-year window of accelerated rearrangement of vision over the nations. Now, when I had the visitation on May 31st, 2008, about the states, God showed me 153 nations. It was very specific. Now, you can imagine I was supposed to be the speaker for these 2,000 people that were gathered at Liberty Park in between Jersey and New York, and the Spirit of God fell on me and lifted me up. And I could see the root structure and the flow of the glory that had come into nations. I could see where the glory had been able to be stopped in nations. I'm thankful I wrote this. I went back and got with the man that I minister with, Dr. Robert Heidler, and we drew a picture of what every state looked like. And now I believe from this, it was very important to understand that the last 3 years of this decade, the Lord would start focusing on every nation and start offering every nation the ability to align with his heavenly purpose. And that's what we're discussing right now. That means we have to look at authority structures, economic structures, and then you're going to see a lot of new power demonstrations, and I don't mean just supernatural from a spiritual standpoint. In the Holy Spirit manifesting, I think we're going to start seeing demonic manifestations like we've never seen before. And we're going to have to discern them. Because Paul says this to us in 2 Thessalonians, do you not understand who opposes you? And we're going to have to know, as this movement begins to move over these next 3 years, what's going to try to stop it? And there's where true prophetic intercessors get in place and began to say, we're going before that, we'll stand in the gap and we'll clear the way. I believe this year is also part of clearing the way. Now, Yeshua demonstrates his love in a person's life, but I think he does the same thing in a nation's life, a people's life, through redemption and release of sustenance. So another way I always look at the nations is what is happening in the redemptive plan that God had for them. Can we find a redemptive root in a nation? And this is important because if you're praying for a nation, you've got to have something to connect down in, or else it has to be birthed some way in that nation. If you don't have anything to connect with there, a root to connect in that nation with, if there's no house of prayer in that people group, you're going to have to birth that. You're going to have to go through it and birth it, and that's really key, especially in some of the nations where Antichrist is moving so strongly. And you don't like the concept, we don't like the concept of war, but sometimes it takes war to produce an opening of change so we can bring this about. Now, this is also known as, this year also looks like this, and we have to recognize this. It's a year of fulfillment. We've been prophesying about hope. That means it's a year of crowning, and a new coronation begins this year. Now, that's for England, wherever you're at in here. A new coronation begins this year. I don't think it will manifest till next year, but it's beginning in the spirit realm. A new coronation is beginning in the spirit realm, where God is beginning to rearrange authority structures. We've seen him do it in Great Britain so supernaturally, but he's going to do it actually in the monarchy there. It's starting this year, and you'll see it manifest probably next year. But it also means it's a year to prosper. So Zion is a Zebulun word. Now that brings us to this weekend. Now I always try to read the Bible in time. And it becomes important we read the Bible in time. This month, as we celebrate first fruits this month, is Pentecost. All right? But it's also the month of Sivan, which is linked with what the year's about. So beginning on, I think it's tomorrow, Friday night, you enter in to some sort of supernatural alignment from heaven over what this year is about. And we're all right here in Israel. This Pentecost, there is a supernatural alignment between heaven and earth of time. Therefore, the nations will start shifting. I mean, it'll happen supernaturally. It's an alignment of heaven and earth where heaven's time frame is supernaturally aligned. In this year of 5777, this is the month and the moment of alignment. And that means the structure starts shifting all around us. The UN, the first week of June is so important. I got an email from Tomas. The first week of June is so important for the nations. So this is very, very key for us. Go ahead, Chad. And in the midst of it, last night when I got here in Israel, the Lord, I couldn't sleep, so at 1:30, the Lord had me go back to where Pentecost was prophesied in Joel. And I just went through the whole book of Joel to get a perspective of what I feel like the Lord is saying to us right now. Now, here's what he's saying, and I feel like these are some wonderful prayer points for us as we pray for ourselves, our families, our nations, the nations of the earth. I believe they are very, very important over how to pray. And I just watched the Lord outline them. And you find that the book of Joel is about revoking an adverse sentence that has been placed on a nation. And all of a sudden, reproaches start being prophesied that they're going to remove. Now, this book is so important in my life because this is when God visited me when I was 18. He spoke to me because our family had a lot and had gone awry in what it had. My dad had acquired all the 12 sections of land of his family. It was called Rehoboth. It covered half of a major portion of East Texas into Louisiana. And corruption got in it. And so when God visited me, he said, I can restore. He died a premature, tragic death when he was 39, and I was the first son and left responsible for all this. Well, you don't want to be responsible for all that when you're 16. And it's just not something you want. So by 18, I tried to drift away from what God was doing, but God. And I ended up under oxygen in a hospital room, and the Lord put me in a room with a Pentecostal preacher. And he led me he introduced me to the Holy Spirit. And he got out, and I stayed there, and God visited me. And revealed himself to me, revealed the word to me, but he said these words to me: I can restore what you've lost. I didn't know it was a scripture until I got to the book of Joel. And in it, one of the things you see, that there comes a time where David's house has to rise up again. Now, I've always thought David's house had to come into a fullness in Jerusalem, in a way like we have never seen it come into a fullness. And it was one of the things that the nations would align with as we come together in Jerusalem. He begins to say how he'll pour a spirit of grace and favor and supplication out. The former and early rains will come. Threshing floors will begin to change. Now that becomes very, very important, that we learn how to look at the threshing floors of a nation and see how are they gathering. And then he goes through this process, and I think this is where we're about to hit in the nations. There were 4 levels of loss prophesied in Joel. And I think we are at a place starting this year, that's why it's going to be a process where you start seeing those levels of loss reversed in nations that will start making their new covenant alignment. I know we're watching it. It is a hard process. When you just take America as a nation, it is a very hard process to reverse ungodliness. Then he starts prophesying, and was Israel at the crossroads. He starts prophesying a new outpouring of prophecy, signs, wonders. Amen. And that has to come. When this window comes over you, you have to allow the prophecies to come. That's what Celeste was telling me. He said, 3 years ago, you prophesied about Togo, and then I was confronted, and people said, you can't believe in prophecy. Well, you're not going to, without prophetic utterance, people go backwards, become ignorant, and eventually are no more. That's what that word means. Without a vision, a people perish. Now, here's where I think we're looking in every nation, and that's where I saw something so resonated with me with this march. because I think it's a way to get the triumphant reserve, God's people focused together and moving. Very, very key. And then you find in the book of Joel these two other issues here that become so very important for us. Nations are realigned and delivered around Israel. You find the same thing over in the book of Ephesians. So see, anytime you find some prophecy in the Old Covenant, you can go over and find it also in the New Covenant being manifested. And so you're finding nations now are going to start being delivered based upon how they realign with Israel. And it's also a warning in the book of Joel about those who try to blockade Israel financially. Now, this is something we have to watch for. A judgment will come on those nations and they'll be scattered. Also, you have to watch nations that have come against Israel financially. If they don't reverse that, you're going to start seeing, that's how you're going to tell a goat nation. They'll be very scattered in days ahead. For this window of 3 years ahead for us, it becomes really important for us. All right, now, here's what I think is so important for us is I believe we're at a time of choice. And we're choosing right now. I believe the choosing has begun this year. I think it started at Rosh Hashanah this year, and nations are beginning to choose. Now, let's read one verse out of Joel, chapter 3, which Harold's whole book is based upon. And it is, proclaim to the nations, prepare for war. And it says, the nations are multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Now, I think that is very key for us right now. The Lord will roar from Zion. It goes right into, from that, the Lord will roar from Zion. Now, this is what that means to me. It means that out of Jerusalem, we start prophesying to the nations. Jerusalem will have a prophetic voice that determines let me say this right, determines the unlocking of redemption in nations or the judgment of nations. And that is starting now. I think when you look at certain prophetic words, you see certain alignments happening, and I believe a new prophetic mantle is coming on Zion so that it begins to look at a nation and can say the redemptive plan of God over that nation. And we want to ask the Lord to cause that mantle to so come alive here in Israel that it becomes a prophet in this season.
Yes.
The nation that the Lord said, you stoned the prophets, we decree that it is becoming a prophet to the nations. Now that's a very, very important statement for us to watch, to pray into, and to decree that the voice of God will be heard from Israel. I think that's the biggest shift I see. Instead of everybody praying for the peace of Jerusalem, something is happening right now for Jerusalem to become a prophet to the nations. And we decree that shift going on right now. We decree it starting to shift now. we decree that when we walk under that window here in Israel, especially in Jerusalem, we feel a prophetic mantle come on us to prophesy back to the nations. And I decree that every path people come into Jerusalem, we will be able to prophesy back across that path. Every place it's come, we can prophesy back down the path that people walked and represented that got to this city. And I'm not sure Jerusalem has seen itself as a prophet, but it was one of the things that grieved the Lord, that it didn't see its time of visitation. That means it wasn't willing to be audited in a way that it would change at that moment. I believe Jerusalem is ready to make a shift. I believe there's enough movement of God and the body of Christ for it to shift.
The radio station in Israel is Kol Israel, the voice of Israel. But I say the body will be Kol Israel. The body will be the voice of Israel. The body will be Kol Elohim. It'll be the voice of God. And that this voice will go out from Israel. It won't be the radio. It will be the body that will be the voice. Kol Israel.
Just need to, in a practical way, so you can pray into this. There is a shift happening in this nation among many of the spiritual leaders and in this city. And I'm seeing something in the last 3-4 months that is new. Recently, there was a calling together of several Messianic pastors and leaders from around the country to discern a word that had come from overseas. Normally, a group that came together, pastors like that, would have talked for 2.5 hours and maybe prayed a half hour. They prayed and worshiped for 2.5 hours. And then they had heard, and they just needed to talk an hour. So something was shifting there. Recently, Benjamin Berger, that was here, his brother Reuven, called several leaders in Jerusalem to their home. And they said, we believe God is saying that every month we need to meet together, take a prophetic passage of the scriptures that prophesies about Jerusalem, meditate on that together, share what God is speaking, and then pray in that together and say, God, how do we prepare as the body here in Jerusalem? And this included Arab pastors as well. So it was Jewish and Arab pastors, and I was there as an international for the House of Prayer. And but this prophetic listening, prophetic seeking to hear what is God saying to us now and through us, and what does he want to do. So please pray for protection upon these kinds of relationships.
Well, and not only will it shift here, it'll be able to shift the world. Because we have to remember, this is what the world focuses on in days ahead. And so we want to ask the Lord at the end of, which I'm almost through, to put that prophetic mantle down on this city so that it becomes a prophet to the nations. Now, another thing that you see is the tabernacle of David gets restored in the nations who choose. I think it's part of the choosing process, because in Amos it goes on to say that as Amos prophesied the tabernacle of David, that would be the defining issue in the nations. Because the Gentiles, and this is really where one new man comes in, the Gentiles, it's not, see, Robert wrote a book, Messianic Church Arising. It's gone all over the world. But really, I think we're moving beyond just the Messianic church now into a one new man kingdom authority. Yes. Which that's a big shift, one new man kingdom authority. And that comes through the tabernacle of David being restored. And though it began here in Jerusalem, that's where the nations can realign it. And one of the things that I'm seeing in America that we're attempting to do is to make people understand how the tabernacle of David, how them embracing it and restoring that in their territory is a major part of the glory of God coming, but it realigns us back here. And vice versa. I think once the tabernacle of David is seen coming, being restored in Jerusalem, it also realigns the nations. So there's this major covenant realignment, and it's coming through the tabernacle of David being restored. I was looking at it in Acts. Go ahead, Chad, and let's look at it. I put this up here. And somebody said it this morning. See, it's time for us to build again. And I believe God has activated a law, a supernatural law. Don't shy back from the word law. It's like the law of gravity. You can't stop it. If I jump off the chair, I'll probably hit harder than others, but it works. A spiritual law works. And a law of restoration has been activated as part of the 777. And it's beginning to work, but it's creating a great war in the earth. But I don't think we're supposed to look at warfare the way we've looked at it in the past either. It's a war over God's presence being established. And we need to review, how is this war, this conflict in a nation going on over the presence of God? Really, that's all you see in America. It is over the presence of God being reestablished from its covenant root. And it's a war over it. Tremendous war over it. And I'm noticing something. When those 100 leaders were in the White House with Vice President Pence, we were one over what we were there for. And it was as many rabbis as key evangelical leaders, but there was no distinguishing that except the look. Because we were there for one purpose, to say the White House of America now, for the first time. Now I want you to think on that. In the first time in the history since Israel has become a nation since 1948, it was the first time that has ever been done in the White House. Now, I saw this in the state of Texas. Texas has always been a friend of Israel. But it wasn't until 2 Passovers ago that the governor signed a sanction that we would be aligned with Israel. See, again, we're back to a place saying you can be friends all you want, but are you going to march? Are you going to sign? Are you going to proclaim? Something is going on right now in the proclamation of alignment. Now, I'm going to say it that way. People are saying, I'm aligned. See, I had to say in the 70s, I am prophetic. And I wasn't embarrassed about it. I was no more embarrassed about that than I was being a Pierce, which we were very famous and infamous in our area. But it was still part of who I was. And I think people are having to say, this is who we are. Nations are having to say, we do believe in the God of Israel. And they can't just say, we love Israel. They have to say, we love the God of Israel. Yeah. And when you reject Israel, you reject the God of Israel. And you reject the root. And then you end up eventually like Germany did. That's how simple that was. Same way with the Reformation movement. It never embraced the root of Israel. And after 500 years, we decree from this meeting right here in Jerusalem that will start overturning. Amen. In the next Reformation, we decree that the next Reformation that goes through the nations will have the covenant root of Israel within it. Now, let me end by saying this. This is another way you look. After these things, I will rebuild the tent of David which has fallen. I will rebuild its ruins and I will restore it. Acts prophesied it. The whole book of Revelation is about that, which we're living in now. Now look at this last statement. When you look at that in Greek and you start really doing it, start really reviewing it, it means this simply. If you're moving forward into the new, then things are turning upside down around you.
Yeah.
So the nations you see things, Brazil, turning upside down, don't let them get back in an old order. Keep them turning upside down until they look like what the Lord wants for this season. That is very key. America is turning upside down. We do not want it to go backwards. We want it to get so turned upside down that it looks like the rebuilt tabernacle of David with the glory of God moving in it. And so, one of the ways that you look is if things are turning upside down in a nation, pray for it. Because that is an opportunity for that nation to realign and to realign back into God's covenant.